for coming. I recently gave a talk at Yale. That's the other university when I'm talking to MIT and Harvard people. And one of the questions I get the most when I give a talk and I talk about my work in DNA sequencing is what's next? And it's usually been a very difficult problem or question to answer. It's usually hard to tell people what's next. But I do think we are at a unique inflection point in history where not only do I feel I can talk about what's next, I believe it's an opportunity to position teams to ride these large waves that I think will shape the future. I do think it's a very, very unique time in terms of what's happening in life sciences, what's happening in physics and the engineering disciplines, and a big emphasis on what's happening in computer science. So I do think it's an amazing time. And historically, I've been a serial entrepreneur. I'll talk a few minutes about the things I've worked on. But as a serial entrepreneur, I would see an opportunity. I'd build a company. I'd focus on trying to literally change the life of somebody I loved through devices or through medicines. And I thought that was a good way to progress in my own career. But again, I do think this is a unique moment in history. And for that reason, I created an incubator that would allow us to support, nurture, finance, and bring together really smart people like Charlie and Max to advise a family of companies, all with a very, very similar strategy. Each would make a device, and that device could be silicon-based, or that device could be carbon-based, like little molecular machines. And in each case, we would use that device to learn something for the first time about nature. In each case, we would aggregate that information, and now you can do that with the cloud. And in each case, we could, for the first time historically, I believe, keep up with a huge amount of information that you could aggregate and analyze it with techniques like deep learning. So we set up this incubator. We have 4 separate independent companies. Each is funded to be successful. We bring together people that really are obsessed with what they do and love what they do. We bring together people across disciplines. It's really amazing when you come visit 4Combinator because you'll see somebody that works in nanophotonics, working with somebody that does IC design, working with somebody that does molecular biology or chemistry. And my goal is to bring together teams, give them impossible challenges, but staff it with people like yourselves, hopefully that don't know they're impossible when you start, so you solve the problems. So I'm going to tell a little bit about my own story. Pretty early on, I thought I was on top of the world. I was CEO of a public company. We had a market cap greater than American Airlines, when airlines actually had market caps. And I was harvesting the results of the first Human Genome Project. The first Human Genome Project was a public effort which decoded 50 people and made a consensus of 50 people, and a private effort that decoded 6 people, mostly Craig Venter, and made a consensus of that. And I had a company, and we had raised, with the help of Michael Fantozzi, about $600 million. And our goal was to mine that public information for drugs. And again, thought I was on top of the world. Company was doing great. 1999, July 2nd, my son Noah was born. And this is a picture of him from the newborn intensive care unit. And he was there because he was having difficulty breathing. And at that moment, I realized I was less interested in the consensus human genome sequence, or the map of all of us, and I really only wanted to know what was my son's genome. Not what he had in common with everybody else, but what was unique to him. And that night, there was a magazine out, and it had a picture of the new Pentium chip. And it was my moment to realize I thought everybody had been developing high-throughput sequencing going in the wrong direction. They had either been making huge facilities, or they had been trying to miniaturize what was the gold standard of sequencing, which had been developed in the 1970s by Sanger, and trying to fit that into the miniature. Both efforts ended up being either costly, setting up the original Sanger sequencing in large factories. So the first two genomes cost $3 billion and $1 billion respectively, and were slow. They took years. Or the second effort to miniaturize the gold standard Sanger basically just used up grant funding and never produced anything. And so my aha moment was realizing that microelectronics didn't come from taking the gold standard, the vacuum tube, and putting it on a single substrate. It came from what at the time was considered an inferior technology, the transistor, and putting it on a single substrate. And that monolithic idea gave us all of modern electronics that we all enjoy. So my contribution was realizing, don't take the gold standard, take something that's inferior, but can be miniaturized. And I took a chemistry that had been used to deduce a single base. It was often called a SNP, or single nucleotide polymorphism, something that would tell you brown eyes from blue eyes, for example. And take that technology, which worked in a test tube, and move it to the miniature, and allow it, instead of doing one bases, to do 10 or 100 bases, and then do it in parallel. And the other contribution my team made was, instead of taking a genome and breaking it up into small pieces and using recombinant DNA in bacteria to keep those separate pieces and allow us to analyze them, we moved it to a method that was purely chemical and could be done really quickly. And it ended up giving rise to an entire industry. And when we first did this, we had two types of comments. This is going to be big. And as someone that works at a company, I immediately tracked down Richard Gibbs and put him on our SAB, our Scientific Advisory Board. And the second comment, we had decoded a genome that was 30,000 letters long. The second comment was that it wouldn't scale. And so this guy was at Berkeley, so I avoided him. But it turns out it did work, it did scale, and you can do genomes pretty easily. So again, things are going pretty nicely. I had made 2 genomic companies and had just sold one of them to Life Technologies. And I was funding some research that I care about. So I will tell you, I only work on things if I love what I do, and I only create companies with people, and many of them are in the room today, that I want to run to work to share my ideas with. So that's basically how I operate. I have to love what I do, and I have to be with people that I want to be with. So I was working on another problem I cared about, and what I cared about was doing surgery without using a knife. And so my daughter has a genetic disease. It probably made me hypersensitive when her younger brother was born, and he wasn't breathing. I was going, oh man, that's why I wanted to sequence my son's genome. My daughter is a pretty good lesson, though. At 6 months, a doctor told me she wouldn't develop speech. Well, she just texted me that she has 3 exams tomorrow at college. So they were off with that. But they were off for a reason, and that was the medical textbooks are based on people that present pretty extreme cases. And if you look at, for example, the most common 350 monogenic genetic disorders, they come about because people present with them, they analyze them, and they say, look how extreme. So it's a lot of selection bias. Nevertheless, my daughter does have effects from that mutation, and one of them is that she has growths in her kidney. And she has multiple growths, and they grow slowly. And so I was sponsoring some work that would take an MRI machine and an ultrasound machine and direct energy at those growths, and then use the MRI machine to say, hey, is the energy going to the right place? And I loved this conceptually, but it had 3 problems. First, there was $6 million worth of equipment. Second, it took hours just to go at one spot. And third, it had low resolution. If your printer took a day to render a page, and then when you looked at it, looked like my youngest 2 had done your page with crayons, it wouldn't be that useful. Or to complicate it, if your printer cost $6 million. So this was a $6 million printer. It took hours to do anything, and it did it with my elbows in terms of the resolution. And so I saw that, and while I was sponsoring the work, I thought there had to be a better way. Well, I saw what I thought was a better way when I saw this character, Max Tegmark, who we'll talk to today, at Google. He was giving a lecture at SciFu, and he said, you know, I think we've made a lot of progress in microelectronics and computation in the last 40 years, and maybe we could rethink the radio telescope. I thought that was pretty good, and I went to Max, and I couldn't come up with a business plan for imaging the universe. I actually had one idea, which was I thought we'd get some really smart ideas that would probably be worth a lot, but I didn't know the probability of getting those ideas by imaging the universe. So I asked Max if we could use some of those ideas, new ways to image, but combine it with some things that I cared about, not only the problem I cared about, that HIFU and the imaging, but some technologies that I had just leveraged in my sequencing company, and that was semiconductors. And Charlie will tell you a lot more about the promises of microelectronics. So the idea was basically to leverage semiconductors, leverage ideas that Max had, and apply it to that problem I showed you in the beginning. I want to do non-invasive surgery. And if you follow the semiconductor industry, you know when they first do something, people badmouth it. Oh yeah, that will never work too well. We saw how that worked out for Kodak and the film industry when they thought, you know, digital cameras would never be a problem. And I knew that I was able to buy a new boat by applying it to DNA sequencing, so I thought in general it was a pretty good idea. So it had worked before for me. Now, I got to be careful how I describe this next slide, but in general, if you've worked with me before, or those of you who haven't worked with me yet, I hope you will, I usually give people problems that are probably too hard to solve. But those are the ones I want solved. Really things that nobody has done before. And Max and I were talking about it, and I'm a little nervous if Nevada is in the audience today. But I said, we need the smartest person that doesn't know better. And he said, well, that's easy, that's Nevada. Nevada had 4 degrees from MIT, so that proves you don't know better. And in each one, he had gotten a 5.0. Perfect. He had Hertz Fellowship to Stanford, so we told him to take a 1-year sabbatic. Again, he didn't know better. 3 years later, we ended up building Butterfly together. Now, if you have one guy that doesn't know better, it actually doesn't solve a problem. So we found other people that didn't know better, and there was an amazing group. Here's Greg and John Peabody. And they didn't know that you couldn't send radar through solid walls. And so they had developed, with Tyler and others, the first through wall radar system. So you could actually see what's happening behind walls. So I call these guys Star Warriors. There's a book from the 1970s about the team that actually brought down the Soviet Union by making these Star Wars weapons. And these guys are in the tradition, really smart people, but doing the wrong thing. Anyhow, that's a little political. But there's another group of people doing the wrong thing that are really smart, and they're called flash boys. Those are the guys that make the mistake of going to work for Goldman Sachs to crack the world's financial systems. One of those happens to be here, another MIT 5.0 graduate, and my nephew. And I lost him to the dark side for 5 years. But what we've been doing is filling our building with Star Warriors and Flash Boys and having them solve problems that matter. The problem that we solve at Butterfly is ultrasound machines are too expensive. We want to make one super cheap. We also know there's a shortage of radiologists. There are literally 38 radiologists in Uganda. So we're not taking anybody's job, but we believe we can make low-cost devices. We can aggregate that information no matter where they are in the world. We can write really smart software that will get almost to the point of a radiologist or make a radiologist 100 times more efficient. And we love this virtuous circle because the devices create information, the information allows us to inform great software, and all of that can make better and better devices and create a wonderful network effect. So we liked it so much that we built Butterfly networks around it. And recently, we've raised about $100 million for Butterfly, so I hope it works. And we're now taking that concept of making a device, aggregating the information, doing smart software, and we've created 3 other companies, and we're looking for people that really are willing to solve problems that other people haven't been able to solve, that are willing never to say an idea is not good, but to say I have a better one, and on the end of the day, instead of having an argument, to just do it. And we surround ourselves with people like Max and Charlie, who you'll hear from, that guide us, because we want to make sure that we're listening and having a conversation and taking the best ideas to solve problems. So that's the 4Combinator story. I use this slide to really say, I'd like to put you on this slide. And we're really picking and looking for the next Charles Towns. He gave me this green laser pointer. And I love sequencing people. So the top 3 people, Gordon Moore, Jim Watson, and Charles Towns, I've actually sequenced their genomes. This we published in Nature. We thought that was good. So this one we published in Nature, and we thought this one was good. This one, my niece actually beamed his genome to a planet 25,000 light years away at Burning Man 2 summers ago. So if someday we're invaded by aliens, I know exactly who they'll look like. With that, I'll bring Manfred up, who'll introduce the rest of the speakers.